The Grand Chamber of the Galactic Council was the largest room ever built by any living species. It sat inside the Nexus Ring, a station the size of a small moon that circled a dead star at the edge of known space. Hundreds of species held seats in the chamber. Their representatives filled rows of curved benches that rose in tiers from the central platform all the way to the ceiling, which was so high that clouds sometimes formed beneath it. And the air inside carried the smell of a dozen different atmospheres, filtered and blended so that everyone could breathe without choking on someone else's biology. Danny Sawyer stood on the central platform with his hands folded behind his back and a patient smile on his face. He was a tall man with gray at his temples and calm brown eyes that never seemed to blink at the wrong moment. He wore the dark blue diplomatic robes that humanity had designed specifically for council sessions, and simple and neat with a silver pin on the collar shaped like a small planet. He had been speaking for nearly 20 minutes about mining rights in the Colwyn Drift, a stretch of unclaimed space rich in rare minerals. His voice was steady and warm. He used phrases like, "with respect to the honored delegation," and "we humbly suggest," and "humanity would be grateful for the council's consideration." Behind him, standing near the edge of the platform, Nate Holden kept his face blank. Nate was Danny's chief aide, a broad-shouldered man with short dark hair and the posture of someone who had spent years in the military before he ever touched a diplomatic briefing. He carried a datapad, but rarely looked at it. His job was to stand behind Danny and look calm. He was very good at it, even when he did not feel calm at all. The reason Nate did not feel calm was sitting in the third row of the eastern tier. Ambassador Drekis of the Torvan Dominion was leaning forward in his seat, with his clawed hands resting on the bench in front of him. He was a tall reptilian creature with dark green scales and yellow eyes that caught the light like polished glass. His mouth was slightly open, showing the edges of teeth that were not designed for eating plants. Danny had just finished a sentence about shared resource development when Drekis interrupted him. This was not unusual. So Drekis interrupted humans the way some people interrupted children. "The council does not need to hear more begging from the short-lived ones," Drekis said. His translator device turned his rumbling speech into flat, mechanical English. "Humans have held a seat for barely 32 years. You are still guests here. Guests do not make demands about who gets to dig in neutral ground." A few delegates shifted in their seats. Some of the younger species looked uncomfortable. The elder races, the 5 oldest civilizations who held the real power on the council, showed no reaction at all. This was normal. Drekis insulted humanity at almost every session. Danny's smile did not waver. He tilted his head slightly and said, "Ambassador Drekis raises a fair point about our relative youth among the stars. We are, of course, aware that we have much to learn from the more experienced members of this body. Perhaps the Torvan, with their long and impressive history, you could share some guidance on how best to approach the Colwyn proposal. I have always admired Torvan architectural traditions, by the way. The arched bridges of your homeworld are considered some of the finest structures in the known galaxy." Drekis blinked. He had not expected a compliment. For a moment he said nothing, then he snorted through his wide nostrils and waved one clawed hand as if pushing the words away. "You see?" Drekis said, turning to address the wider chamber. "Mate, this is what I mean. A domesticated species. They roll over and show their belly at the first sign of challenge. What kind of civilization responds to an insult with flattery?" A low murmur passed through the chamber. Danny simply nodded, as though Drekis had made an excellent observation, and then yielded his remaining speaking time. He stepped back from the platform and gave a small bow to Grand Arbiter Yulan, who sat at the highest point of the chamber in a chair grown from living wood. Yulan was a Valori, one of the oldest races in the galaxy. His body resembled a tall, thin tree with limbs that ended in clusters of delicate fingers. His face, if it could be called that, was a smooth oval of pale bark with 2 deep-set eyes that glowed a soft amber. He acknowledged Danny's bow with a slow nod and moved the session to the next item. Nate followed Danny through the side corridor without speaking. They walked in silence until they reached the human delegation's private wing, a modest set of rooms that Danny had never bothered to upgrade even though he was entitled to a larger space. Danny sat down at his desk and poured himself a glass of water. His hands were steady. His smile was gone now, replaced by a neutral expression that was neither angry nor sad. It was simply the face of a man who had done this exact thing hundreds of times and would do it hundreds more. "One day," Nate said quietly, "I'm going to break that lizard's jaw." "No, you are not," Danny said. Aiken took a sip of water. That evening, a quiet knock came at the delegation's outer door. Nate opened it to find Liaison Sethki standing in the corridor. She was Marathi, an insectoid species about 4 feet tall with a smooth, dark shell and 2 long antennae that moved constantly as she spoke. Her eyes were large and black and reflected the light like deep water. "I need to speak with your ambassador," she said. Her voice was soft and clicking, but her translator made it sound almost musical. Danny met her in the small sitting room. Sethki did not waste time. She told him that her intelligence network had picked up Torvan fleet movements near the Haven sector. At least 8 warships had repositioned in the last 10 cycles. The movements were not part of any announced exercise or patrol. Danny listened carefully. He thanked her. He said he would file a formal concern through the proper diplomatic channels. Sethki's antennae drooped slightly. "Danny," she said, and it was rare for her to use a human's first name. "The proper channels have never stopped the Torvan from doing anything." Danny looked at her for a long moment. Then he smiled, the same warm, patient smile he wore on the chamber floor, and said, "Then we will file it twice." Sethki left without another word. 3 hours later, and several star systems away, Laura Finch sat at the communications console aboard the human frigate USS Steadfast. Laura was young, 26, with red hair tied back, and a habit of chewing the end of her stylus when she was concentrating. The Steadfast was on a routine patrol along the border of Council space, the kind of quiet duty that usually meant long shifts of staring at empty sensor readings. But tonight, something was wrong. Laura had picked up a faint signal from the direction of Haven 4, a small farming colony on the edge of human territory. The signal was broken and full of static. She ran it through 3 different filters trying to clean it up. The static peeled away in layers, and underneath it, Laura began to hear sounds that made her hand stop moving. There were voices. They were not speaking clearly. They were screaming. She reached for the ship's intercom and called the bridge. Her voice was steady, but her fingers were shaking. "Captain Morse," Laura said, I think we have a problem." Haven 4 was not a remarkable world. It had no great cities, no famous landmarks, and no strategic value that anyone had ever thought worth fighting over. It was a small green planet with wide plains of tall grass, mild weather, and rich soil that grew almost anything you put into it. About 12,000 people lived there, most of them farmers and their families who had left Earth or the older colonies looking for a quieter life. The biggest building on the planet was the community hospital in the main settlement, a 2-story structure with white walls and a garden out front, where Heather Cole grew herbs between her shifts. Heather was the colony's chief medical officer, though the title sounded grander than the reality. She had a staff of 9, a supply closet that was always running low on something, and a waiting room where old magazines from Earth sat in a basket by the door, because she thought it gave the place a homely feel. She was a small woman in her 40s with steady hands and a calm voice that could talk a frightened child through a vaccination without a single tear. On the morning it happened, Heather was in her office reviewing supply orders. Governor Liam Duffy was 3 buildings away in the Colony Administration Center and sitting across a table from 2 farmers who could not agree about water distribution from the Eastern River. Liam was a patient man, lean and sun-darkened with deep lines around his eyes from years of squinting in open fields. He had been governor for 6 years, and most of his work involved settling small arguments between neighbors and filling out resource reports for Earth. He liked the job. It was quiet work on a quiet world. At 11 minutes past 9 in the morning, local time, the sky above the main settlement turned white. Liam felt the flash before he heard the sound. The window behind him lit up so brightly that the 2 farmers threw their hands over their eyes. Then the sound came, a deep, rolling crack that shook the walls and knocked a picture frame off the shelf behind his desk. Liam was on his feet and moving toward the door before the shaking stopped. He stepped outside and looked up. The sky, which had been a soft blue just moments ago, was filled with ships. They hung above the settlement like dark stones dropped from heaven, angular and sharp-edged with hulls the color of scorched metal. Liam had never seen a Torvain warship in person, but he had seen enough pictures to know exactly what was floating above his colony. There were at least 6 of them, and more were still appearing, tearing through the upper atmosphere in flashes of light as they dropped out of faster-than-light travel. There had been no warning, no message, and no demand. One moment the sky was empty, and the next it was full of war. The first bombardment hit the communications tower on the north end of town. The explosion turned the tower into a pillar of fire and smoke that rose straight up like a signal nobody would ever receive. The second strike hit the power station. The third hit the road leading south out of the settlement. Liam understood immediately. They were cutting the colony off. No communications, no power, no escape route. And this was not a warning shot. This was the opening move of something planned. He ran back inside and grabbed the emergency radio, a short-range backup unit that every colony kept in a locked cabinet for disasters. He shouted orders to the 2 farmers who were standing frozen near the table. He told one to run to the school and start moving the children south toward the grain district. He told the other to find every member of the civil defense team and bring them to the administration center. And the civil defense team was not a military force. It was 14 volunteers with basic training and equipment that had been outdated before it even arrived on Haven 4. They carried light sidearms and wore padded vests that would stop a fist, but not much else. Against a Torvan ground assault, they were nothing, but they were all Liam had. Within 20 minutes, Torvan landing craft began touching down on the plains east of town. The doors opened and soldiers poured out, tall reptilian figures in dark armor carrying weapons that hummed with energy. They moved in tight formations with the kind of speed and coordination that comes from long practice. They did not announce themselves. They did not broadcast terms of surrender. They simply advanced into the settlement and began shooting. Heather heard the first explosions from her office. By the time she reached the front door of the hospital, she could see smoke rising from at least 4 different points in town. I ordered her staff to grab every supply kit. She was in the middle of the room, surrounded by the chaos. She was in the middle of the room, surrounded by the chaos. She was in the middle of the room, surrounded by the chaos. She was in the middle of the room, surrounded by the chaos. She was in the middle of the room, surrounded by the chaos. She was in the middle of the room, surrounded by the chaos. She was in the middle of the room, surrounded by the chaos. She was in the middle of the room, surrounded by the chaos. She was in the middle of the room, surrounded by the chaos. She was in the middle of the room, surrounded by the chaos. She was in the middle of the room, surrounded by the chaos. She was in the middle of the room, surrounded by the chaos. She was in the middle of the room, surrounded by the chaos. She was in the middle of the room, surrounded by the chaos. She was in the middle of the room, surrounded by the chaos. She was in the middle of the room, surrounded by the chaos. She was in the middle of the room, surrounded by the chaos. She was in the middle of the room, surrounded by the chaos. She was in the middle of the room, surrounded by the chaos. She was in the middle of the room, surrounded by the chaos. She was in the middle of the room, surrounded by the chaos. She was in the middle of the room, surrounded by the chaos. She was in the middle of the room, surrounded by the chaos. She was in the middle of the room, surrounded by the chaos. She was in the middle of the room, surrounded by the chaos. She was in the middle of the room, surrounded by the chaos. She was in the middle of the room, surrounded by the chaos. She was in the middle of the room, surrounded by the chaos. She was in the middle of the room, surrounded by the chaos. She was in the middle of the room, surrounded by the chaos. She was in the middle of the room, surrounded by the chaos. She was in the middle of the room, surrounded by the chaos. She was in the middle of the room, surrounded by the chaos. She was in the middle of the room, surrounded by the chaos. She was in the middle of the room, surrounded by the chaos. She was in the middle of the room, surrounded by the chaos. She was in the middle of the room, surrounded by the chaos. She was in the middle of the room, surrounded by the chaos. She was in the middle of the room, surrounded by the chaos. She was in the middle of the room, surrounded by the chaos. She was in the middle of the room, surrounded by the chaos. She was in the middle, ordered her staff to grab every supply kit they could carry and move everything to the grain warehouse 2 blocks south. It was a large, solid building with thick walls and no windows on the ground floor. It was not a medical facility, but it was the closest thing to safe that she could find. The wounded started arriving within minutes. Farmers, shopkeepers, a teacher with burns on her arms, a child carried by a neighbor who was bleeding from a cut on her forehead. Heather worked without stopping. She spoke in the same calm, steady voice she always used, the one that made people believe things would be all right even when the building shook from another explosion outside. Liam and 3 members of the defense team managed to reach the colony's backup transmitter, a small unit hidden in a storage shed on the western edge of town. See, it had limited range and almost no power, but it could send a single burst transmission into space if he aimed it right. He punched in the emergency frequency, entered the colony's coordinates and a timestamp, and typed 3 words into the message field. "They're killing everyone." He sent the burst. The transmitter burned out after a single use, exactly as it was designed to do. He did not know if anyone would hear it. Several star systems away, Laura Finch was still at her console aboard the USS Steadfast, running every filter she had on the broken signal from Haven 4. Captain Katie Morse had come to the communications bay herself after Laura's call to the bridge. Katie was a woman of about 40 with short brown hair and a face that rarely showed surprise. She stood behind Laura with her arms crossed and watched the data scroll across the screen. "Clean it up," Katie said. "I'm trying," Laura said. Her fingers moved fast across the controls. Layer by layer, the static fell away. The screaming became voices. The voices became words. They listened together. Neither of them spoke for a long time after the audio cleared. Then Katie turned and walked to the bridge without a word. She sat down in her chair, pulled up the navigation console, and plotted a course for Haven 4 at maximum speed. She opened a secure channel and sent a coded message to Earth Command. Then, on the Nexus ring, it was the middle of the day. She was in the middle of a meeting with the Galactic Council. She was in the middle of a meeting with the Galactic Council. She was in the middle of a meeting with the Galactic Council. She was in the middle of a meeting with the Galactic Council. She was in the middle of a meeting with the Galactic Council. She was in the middle of a meeting with the Galactic Council. She was in the middle of a meeting with the Galactic Council. She was in the middle of a meeting with the Galactic Council. She was in the middle of a meeting with the Galactic Council. She was in the middle of a meeting with the Galactic Council. She was in the middle of a meeting with the Galactic Council. She was in the middle of a meeting with the Galactic Council. She was in the middle of a meeting with the Galactic Council. She was in the middle of a meeting with the Galactic Council. She was in the middle of a meeting with the Galactic Council. She was in the middle of a meeting with the Galactic Council. She was in the middle of a meeting with the Galactic Council. She was in the middle of a meeting with the Galactic Council. She was in the middle of a meeting with the Galactic Council. She was in the middle of a meeting with the Galactic Council. She was in the middle of a meeting with the Galactic Council. She was in the middle of a meeting with the Galactic Council. She was in the middle of a meeting with the Galactic Council. She was in the middle of a meeting with the Galactic Council. She was in the middle of a meeting with the Galactic Council. She was in the middle of a meeting with the Galactic Council. She was in the middle of a meeting with the Galactic Council. She was in the middle of a meeting with the Galactic Council. She was in the middle of a meeting with the Galactic Council. She was in the middle of a meeting with the Galactic Council. She was in the middle of a meeting with the Galactic Council. She was in the middle of a meeting with the Galactic Council. She was in the middle of a meeting with the Galactic Council. She was in the middle of a meeting with the Galactic Council. She was in the middle of a meeting with the Galactic Council. She was in the middle of a meeting with the Galactic Council. She was in the middle of a meeting with the Galactic Council. She was in the middle of a meeting with the Galactic Council. She was in the middle of a meeting with the Galactic Council. She was in the middle of a meeting with the Galactic Council. She was in the middle of a meeting with the Galactic Council. She was in the middle of a meeting with the Galactic Council. She was in the middle of a meeting with the Galactic Council. She was in the middle of a meeting with the Galactic Council. She was in the middle of a meeting with the Galactic Council. On the Nexus ring, it was the middle of the night cycle. Danny Sawyer was in his quarters reading when his personal terminal chimed with a priority alert. He set down his book and opened the message. It was from Earth Command, flagged with a red header he had only seen twice in his entire career. And he read the report once, then read it again. Nate Holden arrived at Danny's door 2 minutes later, because the same alert had gone to his terminal as well. He found Danny sitting at his desk staring at the wall. The report was still glowing on the screen beside him. Nate had served with Danny for 11 years. He had seen the man sit through insults, threats, trade collapses, and one incident where a Torvan delegate had actually spat on the floor in front of him. Through all of it, and Danny had smiled. Through all of it, Danny had been polite. Danny was not smiling now. His face was completely still like a lake with no wind, and something about that stillness was more frightening than any anger Nate had ever seen. "I need an emergency session," Danny said. His voice was quiet. "Full council, priority 1. Nate nodded. "What approach do we take? What framing? Do we want to—" "None," Danny said. Nate stopped talking. He looked at Danny for a long moment, and then he understood. Something behind the ambassador's eyes had changed. Something that had been held in place for 32 years by patience and choice, and the belief that the system worked. That thing had just come loose. Nate left to make the arrangements. Danny stayed at his desk. He did not read any more that night. The emergency session was called for the following cycle, and by the time the chamber doors opened, every seat was full. Word had spread fast. Thus, a priority 1 summons had not been used in over a century. Not since the Valori border wars that nearly tore the Council apart before most of the current species had even discovered fire. The fact that a human had invoked it sent ripples through every delegation on the Nexus ring. The gallery above the main floor was packed with observers, journalists, aides, and junior diplomats who had given up their rest cycles to be present. And the air in the chamber carried a tension that was hard to describe, but easy to feel. It was the kind of silence that fills a room when everyone knows something important is about to happen, but nobody knows exactly what. Grand Arbiter Yulan sat in his raised chair at the top of the chamber, his amber eyes glowing softly in the artificial light. His long wooden fingers rested on the arms of his seat. He had presided over thousands of sessions, but even he seemed more alert than usual. His bark-like face, which rarely showed expression, carried the faintest crease along his brow. The delegation settled into their seats. Drekis was in his usual place in the eastern tier, leaning back with his arms folded across his scaled chest. His yellow eyes scanned the room with the lazy confidence of someone who believed nothing in this chamber could touch him. Around him, the other Torvan delegates sat in a tight cluster, their tails curled beneath their benches. The side door opened, and Danny Sawyer walked in. Every head in the chamber turned. A low murmur rippled through the rows, because Danny was not wearing his diplomatic robes. He wore a plain dark suit, the kind a man might wear to a funeral. There was no silver pin on his collar. He carried no datapad, no folder, no prepared notes. His hands were empty and hung at his sides. Nate Holden followed him through the door, but did not walk to his usual position beside the platform. Instead, he stopped near the entrance and stood with his back against the wall, his arms folded, watching. Danny walked to the central platform alone. His shoes made a quiet, steady sound on the stone floor, and in the silence of the chamber, that small sound was the only thing anyone could hear. He stepped up onto the platform and stood still. Yulon spoke first. Ambassador Sawyer, you have invoked a Priority 1 summons before this body. The floor is yours. Please present your grievance. Danny did not speak immediately. He stood on the platform and looked around the chamber, slowly, moving his gaze from one delegation to the next. He looked at the Marathi section where Sethki sat with her antennae held perfectly still. He looked at the elder races in their high seats. He looked at the younger species in the lower rows who had always admired humanity's patience. He looked at each of them in turn, and his face showed nothing at all. Then he spoke. And his voice was not loud. It was low and even and carried through the chamber the way a cold wind carries through an open door. There was no anger in it, not yet. There was something worse. There was the absolute calm of a man who had already decided what he was going to do and was simply informing everyone else. 19 hours ago, Danny said, a Torvan strike fleet consisting of 11 warships entered the Haven system without warning or provocation. They dropped out of faster-than-light travel directly above the colony of Haven 4, a farming world with a population of 12,000 civilians. They began orbital bombardment within 4 minutes of arrival. He paused. The chamber was so quiet that the hum of the air filtration system sounded like thunder. The first target was the colony's communications tower. The second was the power station. The third was the main road leading to the southern districts. While these strikes were designed to prevent the colonists from calling for help or escaping. Once the colony was cut off, ground troops landed and entered the settlement. Danny's voice did not waver. He spoke the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis, clear and factual and without decoration. The Torvan ground forces did not issue a warning. They did not demand surrender. They did not distinguish between armed and unarmed targets, because there were almost no armed targets to distinguish. Haven 4 had no military garrison. Its civil defense team consisted of 14 volunteers with outdated equipment. The colony had a school, a hospital, a grain exchange, and farmland. That is all it had. He took a single step forward on the platform. The community hospital was destroyed in the second wave of bombardment. The school was hit 8 minutes later. As of my last communication with Earth Command, confirmed civilian casualties on Haven 4 number over 2,000, with that figure expected to rise. Among the confirmed dead are 31 children under the age of 10. The murmur that passed through the chamber this time was different. It was not curiosity. It was the sound of hundreds of beings drawing breath at the same time. Danny turned and looked directly at Drekis. The Torvan ambassador had not moved, but his yellow eyes were slightly wider than before. His clawed hands, which had been folded casually across his chest, Torvan fleet that attacked Haven 4. Their identity of every ship in the Torvan fleet that attacked Haven 4. Their registration codes, their weapon signatures, and their fleet command frequency have all been verified. Do you deny this? The chamber waited. Drekis did not answer immediately. He glanced to his left, where his senior military advisor sat with a rigid expression, and then he stood. "The Haven system lies within disputed territory," Drekis said. His translator rendered his voice flat and mechanical, but there was a tightness in his posture that had not been there before. "The Torvan Dominion has the right to secure its borders and enforce its territorial claims. Any settlement within that zone operates at its own risk. This was a border enforcement action, nothing more." Danny listened to every word without moving. When Drekis finished and sat down, and Danny did not respond to him. Instead, he turned back to the full chamber. "For 32 years, Danny said, humanity has been a member of this council. In that time, we have filed over 400 formal complaints through proper diplomatic channels. We have submitted grievances, requested mediations, and appealed to this body for fair treatment. We have done so politely. We have done so patiently. When we were insulted on this floor, we responded with courtesy. When our ships were harassed in neutral space, we filed reports. When our people were called vermin and domesticated animals, we smiled and yielded our speaking time." His voice had not risen. If anything, it had dropped lower, and the lower it went, the more the chamber seemed to lean forward to hear it. "We did this because we believed in the system. We believed that if we were good neighbors, if we followed every rule, if we showed respect to every species regardless of how they treated us, the system would protect us. We believed that politeness and patience would be enough." He stopped. For a moment he stood in silence, and then something in his expression shifted. It was not dramatic. His face did not twist with rage, his voice did not crack with emotion, but something behind his eyes hardened, like water turning to ice, and every being in the chamber felt it. "We were wrong," he said. He let that sit for 3 full seconds before he continued. "Effective immediately. Humanity withdraws all pending diplomatic appeals, all trade negotiations, and all cultural exchange programs with every member of this council. All of them. We are done asking." The murmur in the chamber rose sharply. Yulan raised one long hand for silence, but it took several seconds for the noise to die down. Danny turned once more to Drekis. He looked at the Torvan ambassador the way a man looks at something he has already moved past. "An event of your species next century. Then event of your species next century." Then he turned to Yulan. "Grand Arbiter, humanity is invoking Article 12 of the Founding Compact, the right of retaliatory self-defense. Under that article, no further council approval is needed or requested. This is a notification, not a request." The chamber erupted. Delegates rose from their seats. The voices overlapped in a dozen languages. Yulan called for order, his deep voice cutting through the noise, but even he could not restore silence quickly. Danny did not wait for order to return. He stepped down from the platform and walked toward the side door where Nate Holden was waiting. He did not bow to the Arbiter. He did not thank the chamber. He did not look back. Nate opened the door for him. As Danny passed through it, Nate glanced back at the chamber one last time. And in the eastern tier, Drekis was standing with his claws gripping the bench so hard that the wood had cracked beneath them. In the Marathi section, Sethki sat perfectly still, her black eyes reflecting the light, her antennae motionless for the first time anyone could remember. Nate smiled. Then he closed the door behind them, and the sound of it shutting was the quietest and loudest thing the Grand Chamber had ever heard. The USS Steadfast dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Haven system and immediately went to full alert. Laura Finch's console lit up with contacts before the ship had even finished decelerating. 11 Torvan warships sat in orbit above Haven 4, arranged in a loose formation that suggested they had no reason to worry about being attacked. They were big ships, each one at least 3 times the size of the Steadfast, with heavy armor plating and weapon arrays that glowed faintly along their hulls. Captain Katie Morse stood on the bridge with her hands resting on the back of her chair. She studied the tactical display in silence, her eyes moving from one red contact marker to the next. The math was simple. 1 human frigate against 11 Torvan warships. In a straight fight, the steadfast would last about 4 minutes, and that was being generous. "I'd open a channel to the lead Torvain vessel," Katie said. Her communications officer looked at her. "Captain, are you sure?" "Open the channel." The channel opened with a click and a hiss of static. Katie straightened her jacket and spoke in a clear, steady voice. "This is Captain Katie Morse of the human frigate USS Steadfast. I am assuming protective authority over the colony of Haven 4 under Article 12 of the Galactic Council Founding Compact. You have 1 standard cycle to withdraw all vessels and ground forces from this system. This is your only notification." There was a pause. Then the screen at the front of the bridge flickered, and the face of Warlord Gorath appeared. He was large, even by Torvan standards, with dark scales that were nearly black and a row of bony ridges running from his forehead to the back of his skull. His yellow eyes looked at Katie the way a predator looks at something too small to be considered food. "Say 1 frigate," Gorath said. His translated voice was deep and flat. "You bring 1 frigate to my fleet and tell me to leave. Is this what passes for military thinking among humans?" Katie did not blink. "I brought 1 frigate because 1 is all I needed to deliver the message." "And what message is that?" Katie tilted her head slightly and allowed herself a small smile. "I'm not your problem, Warlord. I'm just the one who showed up first to ask nicely." Gorath stared at her for a long moment. Then he made a sound that might have been a laugh, though it sounded more like rocks grinding together. He cut the channel without responding. Katie sat down in her chair and looked at her tactical officer. "Start the clock," she said, "and keep sensors at maximum range. We are going to have company soon." The first signatures appeared 6 hours later. Laura Finch saw them first. New contacts, a dropping out of faster-than-light travel at the far edge of the system. She counted them as they appeared on her screen. 2, 5, 8, 12. She kept counting. The numbers kept climbing. "Captain," Laura said, and her voice had an edge to it that she could not quite control. "I'm reading new FTL arrivals bearing 035. Multiple contacts." She paused as more signals appeared. "Many contacts." Katie stood and walked to the sensor display. She watched the blue dots multiply across the screen like stars coming to life. They arrived in waves, dropping out of FTL in a staggered pattern that was too clean and too precise to be a scrambled response. These ships had been positioned ahead of time. They had been waiting. 47 human warships materialized in the Haven system over the next 90 minutes. They arrived in battle formation. By spreading outward in a wide arc that slowly curved around the planet like a hand closing around a fist. Destroyers took the flanks. Cruisers formed the spine. Missile frigates slotted into gaps between the larger ships with the smooth precision of pieces fitting into a puzzle. And at the center of the formation, the last ship to arrive, was the carrier USS Langston Ridge. It was enormous. It dwarfed every other human vessel in the formation the way a mountain dwarfs the hills around it. Now, its hull was dark gray and angular, built with clean lines and sharp edges that made it look less like a ship and more like a weapon that someone had decided to put engines on. Along its sides, launch bays stood open, and inside them rows of fighter craft sat ready on their rails like teeth in a jaw. No alien species had ever seen the Langston Ridge before. No alien species had known it existed. It had been built in secret and assembled piece by piece inside a hollowed-out asteroid in a system that humanity had never reported to the Galactic Council. Its construction had taken 11 years. Its existence had been the most closely guarded secret in human space. On the Nexus ring, the reaction was immediate. The Council's long-range sensor network picked up the fleet signatures within minutes, and the data was relayed to every delegation in the chamber. Representatives who had been in the middle of arguing about the emergency session stopped talking. Screens across the station displayed the same image, a tactical overlay of the Haven system showing a wall of blue contacts surrounding the Torvan fleet like a net. Grand Arbiter Yulan stared at the display from his private chamber. His wooden fingers pressed slowly against the surface of his desk, leaving faint marks in the polished surface. They had a hidden fleet, he said quietly. His aide, a young Valori with pale green bark, stood nearby. Grand Arbiter, the size of the human formation suggests years of preparation. The carrier alone is larger than anything in our records. Yulan was silent for a long time. He had lived for over 800 years. He had seen empires rise and fall. He had watched species tear themselves apart, and he had watched others build themselves into something greater than anyone expected. He thought he had seen everything. And he had not expected this. In the Marathi delegation's quarters, Sethki sat alone at her terminal, scrolling through old human cultural databases. She had been studying humanity since they first arrived on the Nexus Ring, long before it was fashionable or useful to do so. She found what she was looking for in a file on historical Earth leaders, a phrase attributed to a human president who had lived centuries ago. She read it twice, and then translated it into Valori and sent it to Yulan's terminal with no additional comment. The message read, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." Back in the Haven system, Gorath was no longer laughing. His fleet was surrounded. Every exit vector, every possible escape route was blocked by human warships that had positioned themselves with a precision that spoke of careful planning and rehearsal. The Torvan ships were bigger individually, but they were outnumbered more than 4-1, and then the human formation left no gaps. Gorath opened a channel, not to Katie, but to the Nexus Ring. He demanded immediate council intervention. He called the human fleet an act of aggression. He invoked 3 separate council treaties and demanded that Yulan order the humans to stand down. Yulan contacted Danny Sawyer, who was no longer on the Nexus Ring. Danny was aboard a fast transport, already en route to the fleet. His face appeared on Yulan's screen, calm and composed, and with the dark interior of the transport visible behind him. "Ambassador Sawyer," Yulan said, and for the first time in anyone's memory, the Grand Arbiter's voice carried something that sounded close to urgency. "The Torvan are requesting council mediation. I urge you to consider a diplomatic path before this situation moves beyond recovery." Danny looked at Yulan with an expression that was not hostile but was also not open to discussion. To mediate. 32 years of formal to mediate. 32 years of formal complaints, filed properly, through proper channels, all of which were ignored or tabled or buried in committee. We asked for help. We followed every rule. Nobody came. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was not angry. It was simply final. "We will handle it from here." The channel closed. On the bridge of the USS Steadfast, Katie Morse watched the tactical display and waited. The Torvane fleet had not moved. Gorath was a warrior, and warriors did not surrender without testing the cage first. She expected him to try something. She was right. 3 Torvan destroyers broke formation and accelerated toward the weakest-looking point in the human line, a gap between 2 cruisers on the northern arc. It was a probing attack, designed to test whether the humans would actually shoot. The 2 cruisers did not hesitate. They fired in perfect coordination, placing their shots with a precision that spoke of thousands of hours of training simulation. The lead Torvan destroyer took 4 direct hits to its engine block and went dark, drifting sideways with smoke pouring from its hull. The other 2 pulled back immediately. Gorath stared at his tactical display. His claws left deep scratches in the arms of his command chair. He had seen enough. The humans were not bluffing. and the humans had never been bluffing. Katie opened a channel to the Torvain fleet on all frequencies. Her voice was calm and professional, the voice of an officer doing a job she had been trained for her entire life. All Torvain vessels, this is Captain Morse. You will power down your weapons and engines immediately. You will open your hangar bays for boarding. Any vessel that does not comply within 10 minutes will be disabled by force. There will be no further warnings. The line was silent for a long time. Then, one by one, the lights on the Torvain warships began to go out as their systems powered down. Engine glows faded. Weapon arrays retracted. Hangar doors opened. Katie sat back in her chair and let out a long, slow breath. She looked at Laura, who was staring at her console with wide eyes and trembling hands. "Good work, Finch," Katie said quietly. "You heard them first. That matters." Laura nodded. She did not trust herself to speak. Outside the bridge windows, the USS Langston Ridge moved slowly into position above Haven 4, its shadow falling across the planet like a shield. Below it on the surface, 12,000 people looked up and saw something they had not seen in days. Hope. The battle, if it could even be called that, lasted less than an hour. Every Torvain warship was boarded by human marine teams who moved through the alien corridors with the kind of quiet efficiency that comes from years of training for exactly this sort of thing. The Torvain crews were disarmed and confined to their quarters. Weapons were stripped from every ship. Navigation systems were locked. Engine cores were shut down and sealed under human encryption codes that would take Torvain engineers years to break. Warlord Gorath was the last to be taken, and he stood on the bridge of his flagship as the human marines entered, his clawed hands at his sides and his yellow eyes burning with a fury he could not act on. He did not resist. He was a warrior, and warriors understood when a fight was over. He looked at the Marine squad leader, a quiet woman with short hair and no expression on her face, and he said nothing as she placed restraining bands around his wrists. He was transported to the Nexus Ring under armed escort to face charges. Not charges from the Galactic Council, but from a human military tribunal operating under Article 12. The distinction was important. Humanity was not asking the Council to deliver justice. Humanity was delivering it themselves. On the surface of Haven 4, the first human transport ships began landing before the Torvain crews had even finished surrendering. Heather Cole was still in the grain warehouse when she heard the sound of engines outside. She stepped through the door, squinting against the sunlight, and saw a row of heavy transports settling onto the scorched ground with their rear ramps already lowering. People in uniform poured out carrying cases of medical supplies, water purification units, portable shelter kits, and enough food to feed the colony for months. Behind the first wave came engineers with construction equipment. Behind them came doctors, real doctors with full surgical kits and field hospitals that could be assembled in under an hour. Heather stood in the doorway of the warehouse and watched them come. She had not slept in 2 days. Her hands were still stained with blood that she had not had time to wash away. A young medic from one of the transports jogged over to her and asked if she was the chief medical officer. She said yes. He told her that a full medical team was setting up a field hospital 200 meters east, and that she was welcome to hand over her patients whenever she was ready. She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Give me 10 minutes to brief your lead surgeon," she said, and her voice was as steady as it had ever been. Liam Duffy was alive. He had taken burns along both his arms during the bombardment and had a gash above his left eye that had been sealed with emergency adhesive and nothing else. When the human military liaison found him, he was standing in front of the ruined hospital. I told Liam that a full reconstruction team was on its way, and that the colony had been placed under military protection until further notice. Liam listened, nodded, and then asked the officer if he could borrow a shovel. He wanted to start clearing the road before the heavy equipment arrived. When the officer blinked. "Sir, you've been through a major attack. You should see a medic." Liam looked down at his burned arms, then back at the officer. "I'll see a medic after I clear the road," he said, and walked away to find a shovel. That was the kind of people who lived on Haven 4. That was the kind of people who had been attacked. On the Nexus Ring, 3 days passed before Danny Sawyer returned to the Grand Chamber. The Council had been in a state of quiet chaos since his walkout. Delegations that had never spoken to each other were suddenly holding private meetings. The elder races had convened twice without reaching any agreement. The Torvan delegation had gone completely silent, their seats in the Eastern Tier empty for the first time in centuries. When Danny walked into the chamber on the 4th day, he was wearing his diplomatic robes again. The dark blue fabric, the silver pin on the collar, the neat and simple design that humanity had always used. He carried a single datapad in one hand. His expression was calm and pleasant, and when he stepped onto the central platform, he gave a small bow to Grand Arbiter Yulan. It was exactly the same as before. Every gesture, every detail, was the polished, courteous Danny Sawyer that the Council had known for years. But it was not the same, and everyone in the chamber knew it. The smile was there, but behind it was something that had not been there before, and a weight that changed the meaning of every polite word he spoke. It was like looking at a sheathed sword. The blade was hidden, but you knew it was there because you had seen it drawn. "Grand Arbiter," Danny said warmly, "thank you for granting this session. Humanity appreciates the Council's time, as always." Yulan nodded slowly. His amber eyes studied Danny with the careful attention of someone looking at a thing they had badly underestimated. Danny began to speak. He outlined a new set of terms for humanity's continued membership in the Galactic Council. He presented them clearly, calmly, and with the same diplomatic phrasing he had always used. He said, "We respectfully propose," and "humanity would be grateful," and with the Council's kind consideration. The terms themselves, however, were not humble at all. Humanity required formal recognition of all its territorial claims, including Haven 4 and the surrounding systems. The humanity required a permanent seat among the elder races, expanding the group from 5 to 6. Humanity required independent authority over its own border defense, with no council oversight or approval needed for military deployments in human space. And humanity required a formal public condemnation of the Torvain attack on Haven 4 to be entered into the permanent council record. Danny read each term in the same pleasant voice. When he finished, he looked up from his datapad and smiled. "We trust the Council will find these proposals reasonable," he said. The chamber was silent. Yulan looked at the datapad in Danny's hands, then at Danny's face, then at the empty Torvan seats in the Eastern Tier. He thought about the 47 warships sitting in the Haven system. He thought about the carrier that no one had known existed. He thought about 32 years of polite complaints that his council had ignored. "The Council accepts," Yulan said. He did not ask for a vote. Nobody objected. After the session, the delegations filed out of the chamber in near silence. Many of them glanced at Danny as they passed, and the looks they gave him were very different from the ones they had given him before. Some looked at him with new respect. Some looked at him with fear. Most looked at him with the uncomfortable realization that they had been standing next to something dangerous for 32 years without knowing it. Thosethki found Danny in the corridor outside the chamber. She walked beside him in silence for a moment, her dark shell clicking softly against the stone floor, her antennae tilted forward in the Marathi expression of sincerity. "I am glad the mask came off," she said. Danny stopped walking. He looked down at the small insectoid diplomat, and for a moment something passed across his face that was not political or strategic. It was simply honest. "Who said it was a mask?" he said. We really were that polite. We meant every thank you note, every compliment, every yielded speaking turn. That was real. All of it." Sethki's antennae twitched. "Then what changed?" Danny thought about that for a moment. "Nothing changed," he said. You just saw the rest of us. We happen to be kind. We also happen to be everything else. Sethki looked at him for a long time with her deep black eyes. Then she dipped her head in a gesture of respect and walked away. Danny watched her go. "I'll go back to being polite." Nate raised an ipsis point. "Go back to being polite." Nate raised an eyebrow. "Just like that?" "Just like that." Years later, on a quiet afternoon in a Marathi University library, a young student sat reading a history text about the event that scholars had come to call the Haven Incident. The entry described how humanity had returned to its famously courteous diplomatic style in the years that followed. They resumed sending thank-you transmissions after trade agreements. They continued naming cultural exchange ships after alien poets. Their ambassadors smiled in council sessions and yielded speaking time to aggressive delegates and responded to insults with compliments, just as they always had. But the entry ended with a note that the student read twice, as because it struck her as the most important sentence in the entire chapter. It said that after the Haven incident, every species in the galaxy came to understand something that the humans had known about themselves all along. Their politeness was not the absence of strength. It was the strongest proof of it, because only a species capable of devastating, overwhelming force could afford to be that gentle, and only a species that was genuinely kind would choose to be. And the student closed the book and sat quietly for a while, thinking about what it meant to be both of those things at the same time. Outside the library window, a human trade vessel drifted past the station, its hull painted with a Marathi poet's name in silver letters. It moved slowly and gracefully through the dark, and it carried no visible weapons at all. But the student, like everyone else in the galaxy, knew better than to think that meant it was harmless. Nobody ever made that mistake again.